If you love massive, ambitious books that dive headfirst into philosophy, history, art, and politics, and if you've ever wondered how the Enlightenment gave way to the French Revolution, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'm covering the 10th volume in the Story of Civilization, Rousseau and Revolution by Will and Ariel Durant. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today's video is about a book that won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 1968. What a momentous year for revolutions of all kinds, I might say. This book is more than 1,000 pages long, including index and footnotes and all that fun stuff, but regardless, quite long. And it was supposed to be the conclusion to the Durant's lifelong project, I think for like the third time. So let's take a look at this sprawling and brilliant work, Rousseau and Revolution. This volume is the 10th volume in the Story of Civilization, a project which Will Durant began in 1929. While he was credited as the only author, but I think even from the beginning, Ariel played a big role, in the very least in terms of research and editing. And I think she probably even helped with some of the writing, although I can't entirely confirm that. This book was allegedly the final installment, and they even say as much in the opening dedication. Yet a final volume, The Age of Napoleon, would follow more than a decade later. This is not the first time the Durants declared the series complete. Earlier volumes, I believe including The Age of Voltaire, had a similar send-off. There was several other times. But despite that specific inconsistency, Rousseau and Revolution certainly feels like a culmination, at least in certain points of it. The prose is very confident and, as usual, sweeping and even occasionally sentimental, which I think may have something to do with the fact that they thought this was going to be the final work. I think arguably it is the finest volume in the entire series, both in terms of structure and in terms of insight, but that is something for others to decide. However, like other volumes, its structure can be challenging. It moves thematically and geographically, often leaving you wondering whether you're still in France or suddenly in Prussia, Spain, or Naples. But it is definitely still worth giving it a try. The book is divided into 7 massive parts and dozens of chapters covering roughly 1715 to 1789, though it focuses most on the decades leading up to the French Revolution. So let's take a look at it part by part. Actually, let me go ahead and grab my copy. I've been told I should show off copies more often when I have them. So again, the full title, I think that's always something I should point out. The full title of this one is A History of Civilization in France, England, and Germany from 1756, and in the remainder of Europe from 1715 to 1789. That should give you an idea of where the focus is going to be, if we are, of course, going to pick up in those key countries much later than in the rest of Europe. But we'll talk about the structure of it after we take a look at the main parts. So book 1 is the Prelude. This opening section focuses on Rousseau, presenting a sweeping biographical portrait across 4 chapters. Obviously the name of the book comes from Rousseau. There's a lot of reasons why he chooses to focus in on him. I don't know if I've said this before in the other books coming before this. You have specifically the age of Voltaire, but Voltaire plays a big part in 3 or 4 of the books. He just continues, I think well after his actual lifespan, is still frequently referenced, in part because he had such a wide-ranging lifestyle, not always for the best of reasons, but his impact and his influence and the people that he kept up relationships with had this knock-on effect that I think is incredibly impactful. Rousseau actually is going to have a similar relationship. That's why the title of this book includes his name, and I also think it is the reason why he structures the way he does. So our first part includes Rousseau the Wanderer, which looks at Rousseau from 1712 to 1756, where he explores his youth, including his hardships, and his intellectual awakening. Then you have the 7 Years' War, which gives a geopolitical context, and it covers the lead up to the Enlightenment's discontent, one of the challenging byproducts and aftermaths of the Enlightenment that in a current world can be hard to understand or appreciate, especially since there is still a general appreciation for much of the Enlightenment. So diving into the complexities of it is something that can be a bit challenging, and one of the things that you see Will and Ariel Durant dealing with in the way they've structured this book, and of course some of the arguments that are actually making. Then you have the section Voltaire Patriarch and Rousseau Romantic and Rousseau Philosopher. They all examine Rousseau's literary and philosophical career, of course including his interaction with Voltaire and the legacy of Voltaire on the education and on just many of the thinkers that came after him. And it's going to take a look at some of the most important works of Rousseau, including ideas of the social contract and Emile. And then we get Rousseau as an outcast. And this talks about his fall from public favor, exile, his inner turmoil, and of course his particular positions as not just an agnostic, but a downright atheist that makes him an unpopular figure among some groups. And I guess this brings us to the conflict of the Enlightenment. And in many ways, that's why Rousseau becomes the embodiment of not just an Enlightenment world, but also a post-Enlightenment world. And it sets up that friction that we actually to this day still see people debating the value of the Enlightenment and the legacy of the Enlightenment as it contributed to not just questions about faith, but in many cases a hostility towards faith. In this section, it's both a philosophical biography and a narrative of the internal revolution. Rousseau becomes a symbol of how Enlightenment ideas begin to challenge the very system that produced them. And then in book 2, France Before the Deluge, 1757 to 1774, this section explores France's cultural, economic, and political atmosphere before the French Revolution. So highlights in this book include the life of the state, which looks at royal finances, which is going to explain a lot for the future of France. It talks about Turgot's reforms and the decline of absolutism, something that it had been famous for during the Enlightenment, and the art of life that covers the salons, the theaters, the visual arts, and the music that still very much defined France during the 18th century. And you get a really rich portrait of Dubarry, Choiseul, and the parliaments, and just a lot of different characters that are a really important part of this time period for France and its cultural and intellectual development. Crucially, this section shows France's contradictions, its growing prosperity and influence, but also its increasing fragility, hence why it's going to set us up for the revolution. In book 3, The Catholic South, which covers from 1715 to 1789, again, you can see how they are taking significant parts of the continent and they're giving them slightly larger scopes so that they can still cover everything, but there is some debate about that approach, which I'll talk about after I cover all the books. In this one, we have a shift to Southern Europe, looking at Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Italy's landscape and music and art are all presented with Durant's signature lyricism, his way of writing, that wonderful, powerful flow that he gets in. You also take a look at Spain's Enlightenment. He chronicles it through Charles III's reforms and especially Goya's early work. In this section, the Spanish Church and the Inquisition receive particularly sharp analysis. The Durants admire much of Catholic piety, but of course you are going to find them to be critical of much of the ecclesiastical corruption which is being manifested in these chapters. Book 5, we are actually going to go beyond the scope of Europe, especially early modern Europe. And we're going to take a look at Islam and the Slavic East, again covering from 1715 to 1796. At this time period, there is a significant part of Europe that is under the control of the Ottomans. And I think it is for that reason that it becomes really hard to tell the history of Europe without also engaging with the history of the Islamic empires, at the very least the Ottoman Empire, but also you could consider taking a look at some of the other Islamic empires that are definitely playing a role in shaping Europe. This is a dense section for sure. It is also fascinating. In it, we're going to visit Turkey as well as Persia. That's going to take us to the south of it, so that does explore beyond the Ottomans as well as North Africa, and so you can see both the Ottoman and Safavid approach there. And then we move into Russia. We take a look at Catherine the Great. This is of course going to be one of the most vivid portraits in the book. It's filled with all of the wonderful contradictions that come out of Russia during this time period, during their state building and their efforts at trying to westernize in some respects, but also still be significant power players. And so we're going to see the autocracy and enlightenment being manifested here. We're also going to see military expansion and literary refinement. There is a section that talks about the rape of Poland. It is quite devastating, and it is going to help introduce what was once a powerful kingdom, and then how it is going to be partitioned by its neighbors, and that's going to be an ongoing issue for Poland, and we'll see how that plays out. Fortunately, because we have the next book, we'll get a little more discussion about Poland's future, but if you know anything about modern history, you just have to keep following it, because it continues to be difficult, at least clear through the fall of the Soviet Union. Book 5 looks at the Protestant North, 1756 to 1789. This section includes Germany's Enlightenment and the rise of key figures like Kant and Goethe and Schiller. And we learn about Frederick the Great's military brilliance and the cultural influence that he is developing. Kant gets an entire chapter, and Durant does a commendable job distilling his complex philosophy, and it is certainly worth a read. And I actually think one of the great introductions to a very challenging figure, someone that I've always been intrigued by, but for a variety of reasons is a complicated figure to really try to appreciate and understand, especially in the concept of an Enlightenment and a Post-Enlightenment Europe. Then you have the Weimar chapters. That is going to take a look at Goethe's Italy journey, as well as Schiller's ideals, and the German Romantic Awakening. It is going to be some of the best parts of this book, and in my opinion, some of the best parts in the whole series. I love his exploration of, I mean, I really enjoy Will and Ariel Durant's exploration of lots of things, but I really enjoyed this one when looking at the Romantic movement and its impact on Europe in the late 18th and we'll actually see this continue into the 19th century. And it goes a long way in helping to understand some of the forces that are going to shape Europe, some of the legacies that Europe is going to not only inherit, but then work with as we move into the 19th century and take a look at a developing Europe that will eventually bring us up to the present. I really think that that Romantic movement is a key part of it, and he does a good job at exploring the origins of it. Book 6 is Johnson's England, 1756 to 1789. This part covers England's politics, its culture, and of course its colonial strife, if you take note of those years. There are going to be chapters on the Industrial Revolution, as well as the American Revolution, and England's internal political drama. This is where we meet Samuel Johnson and Edward Gibbon and Adam Smith, and he, of course, contextualizes each of them, not just as thinkers, but as products of their age. Which brings us to Book 7, The Collapse of Feudal France. Here, the book comes full circle. It takes us back to France. Remember, we started with Rousseau, who is French, just in case I needed to clarify that. And this is, of course, noting that date is going to take us up to the French Revolution. This section is a slow motion collapse of the monarchy. The chapters on Necker, the Diamond Necklace Affair, and Mirabeau show how corruption and indecision doomed the Ancien Regime. The Durants don't just give us the guillotine, but they help us to see the blade being sharpened in the process and understanding why the French Revolution happened when it did, what caused it, and why it was as brutal as it was. This is a monumental book, literally and intellectually. There are some things that are going to be a bit dated about it. Like I said, it came out in 1967, won Pulitzer Prize in 1968. There are going to be a few things that you might take issue with if you are a specialist. I would say that there are, of course, some Orientalist generalizations. There is the occasional gendered language that will make modern readers cringe a little, and not just in things that he quotes. That has been a long-standing part of his series that is incredibly valuable. The primary sources that he quotes, those I think understandably are clearly going to be very reflective of the time in which they were written. But he himself does occasionally phrase something. I'm like, I don't think that would stand up to time. But again, this was written more than, I guess we're coming up on more than 60 years ago. All that is to say that it's elements of when it was written do show, but regardless, I certainly think that is something worth reading for most people who are interested in this time and place. Just, always keep that in the back of your mind. The writing is consistently elegant, as the Durants have always been able to do. You certainly see this weaving of art and music and philosophy and politics into essentially a single narrative that in many respects is unmatched. This is one of the things that a lot of people love about this series. This is one of the reasons why Will and Ariel Durant are so frequently quoted when anyone wants to try to give a brief history of any time period in European history. They frequently go to Will and Ariel Durant, even though they are not specialists, and you certainly can find weaknesses in their what they say, whether it's sources that they choose to share, or there are times where much of the debate at the time has either been overturned, or they already were not at the cutting edge of arguments about many of the things that they include in their books. But the way they write and that ability to create this single narrative is just so good, and I think that's the thing that really just kept people coming back, and it is the thing that kept them going back to this project, and it is something that has, of course, given us this massive series back here. It makes sense that this book won the Pulitzer Prize in 1968. As I've said, that is generally considered a year of global revolution, and it also makes sense that they thought it would be the final volume. They didn't want to deal, in many respects, with the French Revolution and its aftermath. And so there is a deep sense of summation here, of ideas, of reaching some kind of cultural and philosophical climax. And as we can see, society's at a breaking point. So who is this book for? Well, if you're a fan of Enlightenment philosophy, especially Rousseau and Kant, I mean, you're just going to love this book. You're going to love the cross-pollination of the art and literature and the music and the politics and everything. They're just so skilled at. Or if you've read the earlier volumes and you want one of their various final volumes in their mind, this, of course, I would highly recommend it. If you enjoy literary nonfiction that reads like a novel but teaches like a lecture, this is an excellent example of that. I don't necessarily say that for all of their books. I do generally enjoy this series, hence why I've read the whole series. Well, I'm finishing up the 11th book now. I would argue that they have an appreciation for presentation in a way that is not always manifested in many nonfiction books. And I think that is just something that keeps them an ever popular source for the general audience. That being said, I mean, these books are also very detailed, and they cover time periods that your average person is not going to know anything about if they are not somewhat interested in, say, European history or in the various time periods. Very frequently, people are going to be in for a treat of learning completely new things, especially in these later books where they had to make a lot of decisions about the narrative that they would follow. Like I pointed out, this one in particular has that oddity of covering from 1756 until 1789 in the key countries of France, England, and Germany. But then they decided they need to expand the scope if they want to go outside of those core countries. And so looking again at Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and even the Ottomans and the Safavids, they have to go all the way back to 1715 to, I guess, fill out the background information that they want. And I think that's very reflective of the challenges that they had and the decisions they had to make in terms of the approach that they were going to take to this narrative. But when it comes to writing, it's all about making choices, right? And so I think that that's something that you certainly should appreciate. Who is this book not for? Well, if you need chronological clarity, this might be a bit of a challenge for you. It is, in many respects, much more thematically organized, not always entirely linearly. Again, not just because of the variation in scope, depending on what part of the continent you're talking about, but just in the way they talk about individuals. It requires them to just make choices. And I think that is a tool for them to stick to a more narrative approach. But again, that has its limitations. And I think that shows for the most part. Also, if you want diverse perspectives, this is still a predominantly Eurocentric and a largely elite-focused account. We're talking, for the most part, big man history. So they are going to come of an age just as elements of revisionist history are being developed and are being popularized, but it by no means had overtaken the predominant presentation of history. And so you could, again, that would be one of the things that shows just a little how dated they are for even during that time period where they weren't quite engaging with what would become a much more standard way of teaching history, at least within the actual discipline of history. There's always been a variety of ways of presenting history. And not all of them, matter of fact, the majority of them are not going to be on the cutting edge of the discipline. And that's fine. I'm sure lots of fields feel that way. Also, if you're interested in the French Revolution, this ends just before the real fireworks begin. So this is not the one that you're going to want to go to. You're going to want to go to the final volume for that. All in all, reading Rousseau and Revolution reminded me why I really enjoy this series. Even with its structural quirks and the occasionally dated worldview, it offers a powerful synthesis of history and humanism. You don't have to agree with every interpretation to appreciate the beauty of the Durant's craft. Will I read the whole series again? Probably not soon. But this volume in particular, I could certainly see myself reading this one again. I might return to it in maybe a few years, I don't know. But I certainly know that this is a powerful series. Its impact on popular culture, popular historians has been quite long, and I've enjoyed engaging with it, and I certainly look forward to finishing the final book in the series and doing a recap of the series as a whole after I have come through all 11 massive books. Please, I'd love to know your guys' thoughts on this book in particular, if you've read it, especially since this one is a little more distinct in that it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's the one that of all their books that I think got the most attention. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to have a conversation going. Also, if you've enjoyed this video or any of my content, please share it. That goes a long way in getting the word out about this channel. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.